On a freezing winter night, an old woman opened her door to find two shivering puppies outside. With a kind heart, she took them in, wrapping them in blankets, never imagining what was about to unfold. By morning, her quiet cabin in the woods was surrounded. Police cars flashing lights, officers shouting commands. The villagers whispered. Why had the police come? What had those dogs brought with them? The truth would leave an entire town shocked, and her life changed forever. Stay with us until the end, because you won't believe what really happened inside that cabin. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Margaret Hill had learned to live with silence long before the winters grew cruel. At 72, she woke before dawn, boiled water on an old iron stove, and listened to the quiet settle into the wooden walls of her cabin. No radio, no television, just the steady rhythm of a life built far from roads, neighbors, and unnecessary questions. People in town said isolation was dangerous. Margaret believed it was honest. Her cabin stood alone at the edge of the forest, a structure shaped by decades of storms. Every creak had meaning. Every draft had a history. She knew exactly how long it took snow to block the road, how fast the wind could turn unforgiving, and how quickly help disappeared once winter decided to close in. Out here, you prepared, or you paid for it. That afternoon, she stacked firewood higher than usual. The sky had a dull, heavy color she didn't like. Experience told her the storm would arrive early and stay longer than predicted. She checked the locks twice, filled the kettle, and laid out extra blankets near the hearth. Not out of fear, out of habit. Survival wasn't dramatic. It was routine. As night fell, the wind began to rise, dragging through the trees like something restless. Snow followed soon after, thick and blinding, erasing the path that connected her to the rest of the world. Margaret watched it from her window, arms folded, calm but alert. She had endured worse. She always did. Still, something felt different. Not the storm, not the cold. A quiet awareness settled in her chest, subtle and unwelcome. The kind that came before something unexpected. Margaret turned down the lamp and prepared for bed, unaware that before the night was over, the silence she trusted would be broken. And when it would test everything she believed about distance, kindness, and what it truly meant to be alone. By early evening, the storm stopped pretending to be gentle. Snow thickened into heavy sheets, slamming against the cabin windows hard enough to rattle the glass. The wind rose fast, sharp and relentless, screaming through the trees like it was searching for something to tear loose. Margaret moved with quiet urgency, closing shutters, tightening the latch on the back door, her breath slow but focused. This wasn't panic. This was recognition. She had seen this kind of weather before, and it never arrived without consequences. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. Margaret didn't relax. She filled extra lamps, set candles along the table, and kept her coat within reach. Outside, the world was disappearing. The narrow dirt road that led to her cabin vanished under drifting snow, swallowed so completely it looked like it had never existed. No headlights, no tracks, no chance of anyone reaching her if something went wrong. The isolation she chose had officially sealed itself shut. She stood near the window, watching branches bend unnaturally under the weight of ice, listening to the storm pound the cabin like a warning. The temperature dropped quickly, the kind of cold that crept through walls and into bone. Margaret fed the fire again and sat down slowly, hands wrapped around a warm mug, eyes alert. Storms like this didn't just test buildings. They tested decisions. Somewhere deep in the night, the wind shifted direction. The sound changed. Margaret frowned slightly, her body tensing without thought. She leaned forward, listening harder, separating familiar noises from unfamiliar ones. The cabin groaned, the fire crackled, the storm howled, everything exactly as it should be. And yet, beneath it all, something felt off. Not louder, not stronger, closer. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the storm wasn't the most dangerous thing moving toward her cabin that night. It happened sometime after midnight. Margaret had just begun to drift when the sound slipped through the storm, thin and uncertain, like it didn't quite belong to the night. At first, she dismissed it as wind forcing its way through the cracks in the old wood. Cabins made noises in weather like this. She had learned long ago not to chase every creak with worry. Then it came again, softer this time, shorter, almost careful. Margaret opened her eyes and lay still, listening. The fire popped. The wind roared. Snow struck the walls in heavy waves. And beneath it all, barely holding on, was something else. A sound too uneven to be weather, too deliberate to be chance. It carried a rhythm that made her chest tighten, without explanation. She sat up slowly. The sound stopped. Margaret waited, breath shallow, counting the seconds the way she used to during storms when her husband was still alive. 10 passed. Then 20. She began to wonder if exhaustion had finally started playing tricks on her. The night was long. The cold was deep. Fear crept in easily when you lived alone. Then she heard it again. A faint scratching. Weak. Uneven. Followed by something that might have been a whine, or might have been nothing at all. Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed, joints protesting as her feet touched the cold floor. She pulled on her boots and coat, moving quietly, deliberately. Out here, you didn't rush toward unknown sounds. You respected them first. She paused at the door, resting her hand against the wood, feeling the vibration of the storm on the other side. The scratching came once more. Closer now. Right at the door. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. In winters like this, you didn't open doors for noises. You waited until morning. You let nature sort itself out. That was the rule people survived by. But this sound didn't feel like nature. It felt tired. She reached for the lantern, lifted it just enough to light the handle, and rested her hand there without turning it. Snow hissed against the door. Wind screamed past the cabin. Whatever was outside didn't make another sound. As if it was waiting. Margaret swallowed, heart steady but heavy, knowing that whatever she chose next would matter far more than she realized. And for the first time that night, the storm wasn't the thing she feared most. Margaret opened the door only a few inches at first, letting a blade of cold air slice into the cabin. Snow blew sideways across the porch, stinging her face, forcing her to squint into the dark. She expected nothing, or worse, something dangerous stirred up by the storm. Instead, she saw two shapes pressed low against the wooden boards, barely distinguishable from the drifting white. They were dogs, young, medium-sized, soaked through, fur stiff with ice. One leaned heavily into the other, legs shaking so violently they looked ready to give out. Their heads were lowered, not in submission, but exhaustion. They didn't bark when the door creaked open. They didn't growl. They didn't even lift their tails. They simply looked up at her, eyes glassy, breathing shallow and uneven, as if standing was the last thing their bodies could manage. Margaret's breath caught. She scanned the darkness instinctively, half expecting someone to appear behind them. No footsteps, no voices, just wind and snow and two animals that had clearly run out of strength. She noticed their paws first, raw, red, cracked from ice. Then the way their chests moved too fast, too hard, like every breath was borrowed time. "Good Lord," she whispered, more to steady herself than to comfort them. One of the dogs tried to step forward and collapsed instead, catching itself just before hitting the boards. The other didn't move, only shifted closer, bracing its body like it had been doing that all night. There were no collars, no tags, no sign anyone was coming for them. And yet, they weren't frantic. They weren't begging. They were waiting. Margaret hesitated, hand still on the doorframe, the cold biting through her gloves. Letting strangers, human or animal, inside during a storm like this was risky. She was alone, old, far from help. But the alternative sat shivering at her feet, eyes dull with fatigue, bodies already losing the fight against the cold. The wind surged again, louder, crueler. Margaret opened the door wider. "Come on," she said quietly, "before it's too late." The dogs didn't rush her. They didn't bolt inside. They waited until she stepped back, then moved together. Slow, careful, deliberate, crossing the threshold as if they understood exactly how fragile the moment was. Behind them, snow filled in their tracks almost instantly. And with that, Margaret unknowingly sealed herself into a night that would change everything. Margaret closed the door gently, sealing the storm outside, and stood still for a moment as if listening for consequences. The dogs remained where they were, just inside the threshold, water pooling beneath their paws. She moved carefully, setting old wool blankets by the fire, then gestured them forward with a soft motion of her hand. They didn't rush. They approached the warmth slowly, measuring each step, like animals who had learned that sudden comfort could vanish just as fast. She poured water into a shallow bowl and slid it across the floor. One dog lowered its head, took 2 small sips, then stopped. The other didn't drink at all, only watched the door, ears angled, body tense. Margaret frowned. Strays didn't behave like this. Hunger usually overruled caution. These two were calculating, conserving, aware. "Easy now," she murmured, kneeling with a careful groan. She draped blankets over them one layer at a time, leaving their heads uncovered, checking their breathing, as she'd once checked her husband's during long winters when sickness lingered. She didn't rub their paws or force warmth. Shock was a quiet killer. She knew better than to rush kindness. As the trembling eased, details emerged. Their coats were clean beneath the ice, their nails trimmed. Faint marks circled their necks where collars should have been, scratches in the fur, not from neglect, but from something torn away. Margaret's stomach tightened. These dogs belonged to someone. Recently, they settled without command. One positioned itself near the door again, the other closer to her chair, angled just enough to keep her in view. Their eyes never closed fully. When the fire popped, both heads lifted at once, then relaxed only when nothing followed. Margaret sat back in her chair, hands folded, watching them watch the room. Letting them in had felt right, necessary. But as the storm hammered the cabin and the dogs remained alert, guarded, and impossibly calm, another truth settled in. This wasn't simple shelter. This was a choice that had consequences. And whatever had chased these dogs through the snow hadn't been the weather alone. Sleep never really came. Margaret lay on her narrow bed with a lamp turned low, listening to the storm grind against the cabin like a test of patience. The fire burned steady, but the cold pressed in anyway, seeping through the walls in quiet reminders. Each time she shifted, the dogs reacted. Not startled, alert, heads lifting in unison, ears angling toward the door, then the windows, then back to stillness. One dog positioned itself directly in front of the door and did not move again. The other sat near the window, body angled outward, watching the dark as if it could see through snow and night both. They didn't pace. They didn't whine. They simply stayed ready, muscles tight beneath blankets that no longer shook. Margaret noticed the timing. Every gust of wind passed without response. Every creak of wood earned a glance. But when something distant shifted, too subtle for her to name, both dogs stiffened at once. The reaction was precise, controlled, trained. Her chest tightened. She had grown up with farm dogs. She knew the difference between nervous animals and disciplined ones. At some point after midnight, one of the dogs let out a single, low whimper in its sleep. Not fear. Memory. It settled again when the other pressed closer, shoulder to shoulder, forming a quiet wall between Margaret and the storm. The gesture felt intentional, practiced, as if this was how nights were meant to be survived. Margaret sat up and wrapped a shawl tighter around herself. She felt watched over and unsettled by it. Protection was comforting. Protection without explanation was not. She studied the faint scars along their necks when the firelight shifted, pale lines beneath fur, too even to be accidents. Outside, the wind changed pitch. Inside, the dogs rose as one. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply stood, listening, eyes locked on the dark beyond the glass. Margaret followed their gaze and felt a cold awareness settle behind her ribs. Whatever had driven them through the storm hadn't gone far, and whatever it was, they were prepared to face it, here, tonight, for her. Morning arrived without ceremony. No wind, no snowfall, no sound at all. Margaret noticed at the moment she opened her eyes, the kind of silence that felt pressed flat against the world, as if the storm had taken everything with it when it left. She sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin held its breath. The dogs were awake. Both stood near the front of the room, bodies rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the same point beyond the door. They didn't move when Margaret shifted her weight. They didn't look back at her. Whatever had their attention felt immediate, external, and close. Margaret pulled on her sweater and stepped carefully across the floor. Outside the window, the forest looked frozen in time. Snow lay smooth and untouched, the road completely erased. No birds. No wind in the branches. Just a stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant. She reached for the kettle, then stopped. The dogs tensed further. One lowered its head slightly, stance widening. The other took a half step forward, positioning itself between Margaret and the door without touching her. Not aggression. Placement. Deliberate and calm. Her heartbeat quickened, a dull thud in her ears. She had lived alone long enough to trust moments like this. Then she heard it. A distant engine. Low at first, barely more than vibration, but unmistakable. It grew louder by the second, followed by another, then another. Tires crunched over ice and packed snow. Doors slammed somewhere beyond the trees. Human voices cut through the quiet, sharp and controlled. Margaret's hands began to shake. She moved to the window and peered through the frost-edged glass. Dark shapes lined the buried road. Vehicles. Too many. Blue and white paint half hidden under snow. Lights flashing silently in the cold air. Police. Behind her, the dogs didn't bark. They didn't retreat. They held their ground, alert and steady, as if this moment, was what they had been waiting for all night. A heavy knock struck the door. Firm. Official. Margaret stepped back, breath shallow, heart racing as the silence shattered completely. Whatever safety the storm had provided was gone, and whatever she had welcomed inside her home had just brought the world straight to her doorstep. Margaret opened the door slowly, exactly as she'd been told. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to sting her eyes, and the quiet of the forest shattered all at once. Officers stood in a wide arc around the cabin, boots planted, shoulders squared, hands resting near their weapons. No one shouted. No one rushed. The calm was deliberate and frightening. Margaret raised her hands without being asked, the way instinct teaches you when confusion turns dangerous. "I live here," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I don't understand." No one answered her right away. The lead officer's eyes moved past her into the cabin and stopped. His expression tightened in a way Margaret recognized. Recognition mixed with disbelief. Behind her, she felt the dogs shift. Not lunging, not growling. They stepped forward just enough to be seen, bodies aligned with hers. Heads high, eyes focused. The posture wasn't defensive. It was controlled, purposeful. "Ma'am," the officer said carefully, "where did you get the dogs?" Margaret swallowed. "They came to my door last night. They were freezing. I couldn't leave them out there." A murmur rippled through the officers. Radios crackled softly. One man took a step closer, then stopped himself, as if crossing some invisible line. Another officer leaned in and whispered something to the lead. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw the effect. Faces hardened. Stances adjusted. The dogs didn't move. An officer circled to the side, slow and cautious. The dogs' heads tracked him smoothly, eyes never leaving his hands. Margaret felt the shift again, the same unease she'd felt during the night, but now it was mirrored in the men outside. One of them lowered his hand from his weapon, uncertain. Another raised his radio again, voice tight. "These aren't strays," someone muttered. Margaret's heart thudded. "I didn't steal anything," she said quickly. "I didn't even know." "We know," the lead officer interrupted, softer now. "Just stay where you are." The dogs pressed closer to her legs, heat against her calves, solid and grounding. They didn't bark at the officers. They didn't retreat into the cabin. They stood their ground, alert and composed, as if waiting for instructions only they could hear. Snow crunched as more vehicles arrived. Lights flashed across the cabin walls. Neighbors watched from a distance, silhouettes against white. Margaret felt exposed, small, suddenly unsure of the kindness she'd trusted hours earlier. She looked down at the dogs. They looked back up at her, steady, unafraid. Whatever was happening now, it wasn't about a storm anymore. It was about them. They didn't accuse her outright. That was the worst part. The questions came slowly, carefully shaped, like they were testing the ground beneath her feet. Where had the dogs appeared? What time? Had anyone else been with her? Margaret answered each one honestly, her voice growing quieter with every response. The officers wrote things down, but offered nothing back. No explanation, no reassurance. Just nods. Just glances exchanged between uniforms. Snow crunched as a few neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by the lights and the silence. Margaret felt their eyes on her through the cold air. She kept her hands visible, fingers stiff, heart pounding harder with each passing second. She had lived her life avoiding trouble. Now it stood on her porch, measured and official. One officer gestured toward the dogs. Have they behaved aggressively at all? No, Margaret said quickly. They've been calm, watching. They stayed up all night. That earned another look, this one sharper. The dogs stood close to her legs, bodies angled outward, as if forming a quiet barrier. When an officer stepped too close, they didn't growl. They didn't bare teeth. They simply shifted position, blocking the space with disciplined precision. The movement made several officers pause mid-step. Someone muttered under their breath. Another adjusted his stance. These dogs are trained, a voice said quietly. Margaret's stomach dropped. Trained how? No one answered her. A senior officer approached, studying the dogs more closely now. Their posture, their stillness, the way their eyes tracked movement instead of faces. He crouched slowly, careful not to rush. One dog's ears flicked back, alert but controlled. The other never broke eye contact. Margaret felt the air change. Radio chatter picked up, faster now, more urgent. Codes she didn't recognize passed between officers. Someone mentioned a report. Someone else mentioned a timeline. None of it made sense to her, and that made it worse. Fear wasn't loud anymore. It was tight, contained, pressing against her ribs. I only helped them, she said, barely above a whisper. They would have died out there. The senior officer stood again, jaw tight, eyes no longer on her, but on the dogs. We know, he said quietly. That's what makes this complicated. Margaret looked down at the animals she had pulled from the snow, suddenly unsure of what she had invited into her home. The storm had passed, but the danger hadn't. And whatever these dogs were connected to was bigger than her cabin, bigger than the night. And far from finished, the shift happened quietly. No announcement, no raised voices, just a single officer stepping closer, eyes narrowing as he studied the dogs with a focus that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at their faces. He looked at their stance, the angle of their bodies, the way their weight stayed balanced even in stillness. Margaret noticed it too, the sudden gravity in his posture, like a puzzle piece, had slid into place. Sir, the officer said softly into his radio. I need a handler out here. Now. Margaret's heart skipped. Handler, she asked, but no one answered her. Another officer crouched, slow and deliberate, keeping his hands visible. Easy, he murmured, not to calm them, but to test them. One dog's ears twitched. The other's gaze tracked his movement with surgical precision. Neither moved an inch. The reaction was instant, unmistakable. The crouching officer straightened, breath shallow. They're K9, he said. The word landed heavy in the cold air. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Police dogs, she whispered. A senior officer nodded once, eyes fixed on the animals. Missing K9 units, he corrected. From a transport that went down 2 nights ago. Murmurs rippled through the line of officers. Radios crackled. Someone swore under their breath. Margaret struggled to process it. These calm, freezing dogs she'd wrapped in blankets were part of something far larger than her stormy night. She remembered how they'd stayed awake, how they'd positioned themselves, how they'd never panicked. They were declared lost, the officer continued, voice tight. Presumed dead after the storm. The dogs shifted closer to Margaret, not seeking protection, offering it. Their bodies aligned with hers instinctively, as if she were the point they'd chosen to hold. Cameras from arriving units caught the moment. Officers noticed it too. No commands. No signals. Just loyalty playing out in real time. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear. They just came to my door." "We believe you," the senior officer replied, and this time he meant it. A handler finally arrived, breathless, eyes wide the moment he saw them. He stopped short, voice catching. "There's no way," he said quietly. He called their names, softly, carefully. One dog's tail moved once. Just once. Recognition without release. That was all the confirmation anyone needed. The dogs hadn't wandered into the storm. They had survived it. And the woman standing between them wasn't a suspect anymore. She was the reason two national assets, and the truth tied to them, were still standing on that porch. The handler knelt slowly in the snow, careful not to startle them. "Good boys," he said under his breath, not as praise, but recognition. The dogs didn't rush him. They didn't whine or lean forward. They stayed exactly where they were, pressed close to Margaret's legs, body steady, eyes alert. That hesitation told the handler everything. These dogs weren't confused. They weren't scared. They were still working. He stood and turned to the officers. "They didn't run away," he said quietly. "They were deployed." The words cut through the cold. The handler explained what had happened 2 nights earlier. A joint operation. A winter transport. The dogs had been tracking suspects tied to a violent robbery when the vehicle was forced off the road. The storm covered everything: footprints, tire marks, blood. In the chaos, shots were fired. Officers went down. One dog was injured. The suspects fled into the forest. The dogs followed. "They led the suspects away from our people," the handler said, voice tight. "Drew them deeper into the woods. Bought us time." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She remembered their exhaustion, the raw pause, the way one leaned on the other just to stay upright. "They kept tracking," he continued, "until the cold got to them." The officers listened in silence. When they couldn't go on, the handler said, "they did what they're trained to do." He looked at Margaret. They sought the nearest safe structure. Light, warmth, human presence. Her cabin. Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. The night replayed in her mind. The way they hadn't rushed in. The way they'd stayed awake, guarding doors and windows. They hadn't been hiding. They had been protecting. "They collapsed here," the handler said, after completing their task. One officer exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Another removed his hat, staring at the ground. The weight of it settled on everyone at once. These dogs hadn't just survived the storm. They had finished a mission, then dragged themselves through miles of snow to the only place they believed wouldn't turn them away. Margaret's voice trembled. "They stayed awake all night," she said. "I thought they were afraid." The handler swallowed hard. "They weren't afraid," he replied. "They were still on duty." One of the dogs shifted slightly, pressing its shoulder into Margaret's leg, not seeking comfort, offering reassurance. In that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The dogs hadn't come to her cabin to be saved. They had come there because they trusted her with their lives, after they had already risked them for everyone else. The snow kept falling, but no one seemed to feel the cold anymore. The lead officer slowly lowered his weapon. Another followed. Then another. One by one, the tension that had surrounded Margaret's cabin dissolved into something heavier. Silence mixed with shame. No one spoke for several seconds. Margaret stood there, small and hunched in her coat, trying to understand how an ordinary night had turned into this. She hadn't meant to interfere with anything. She hadn't known about operations or suspects or lives hanging in the balance. She had only seen 2 freezing animals on her porch and done what felt human. The handler finally broke the silence. "If she hadn't opened that door," he said quietly, "we would have recovered bodies this morning." The words landed hard. An officer swallowed and looked away. Another rubbed his face with both hands. They had surrounded her house expecting answers, maybe a mistake, maybe a crime. Instead, they were standing in front of the woman who had unknowingly protected trained police dogs, and by extension, the officers those dogs had saved. Margaret's knees weakened. She lowered herself onto the porch step. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words coming out of habit, not guilt. "I didn't know what they were. I just didn't want them to die." The handler shook his head slowly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick, "you did exactly what they were trained to look for. Kindness." One officer stepped forward, removing his cap. His face was red, whether from cold or emotion, no one could tell. "We came here thinking we might need to take something from you," he admitted. "Instead, you gave us everything." Margaret looked down at the dogs. They sat calmly at her feet, their work finally finished. No tension left in their bodies. No need to guard anymore. For the first time since the sirens arrived, Margaret allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, just quietly, because the truth had settled in. She hadn't interfered with justice that night. She had preserved it, without ever knowing it needed saving. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. What had started as a routine recovery turned into a sealed case reopening before noon. Radios crackled nonstop. Names were confirmed. Timelines were rechecked. Pieces that never fit before suddenly locked into place. The dogs were no longer just survivors of a storm. They were witnesses. Inside the cabin, officers photographed the damaged collars, the raw paws, the faint scars hidden beneath fur. Outside, teams followed tracks that had been buried by snow only hours earlier. Every step led back to the same truth. Someone had tried to make these dogs disappear, and failed. Margaret watched from her doorway as the operation unfolded. No one asked her to step back anymore. No one spoke to her like a suspect. They spoke softly now, carefully, with respect. An officer returned from the tree line, breath visible in the cold air. He nodded once to the handler. That single motion said enough. They had what they needed. A senior investigator approached Margaret, notebook closed, no questions left to ask. "Because you opened your door," he said, "we can finally move forward." Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know how. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was hearing. The dogs stayed close, sitting on either side of her chair like anchors. Calm, steady, as if they understood this moment mattered. Across the road, an unmarked vehicle pulled in. Another officer stepped out, phone pressed to his ear. His tone was low, controlled, urgent. Arrests were being authorized. Warrants approved. A chain reaction had begun. Justice didn't arrive with sirens this time. It arrived quietly, methodically. Margaret felt it then, the shift. The moment when everything turned. Suspicion had given way to certainty. Chaos had found direction. An officer walked past her and paused. He stopped, turned back, and met her eyes. "You didn't just help us," he said. "You changed the outcome." Margaret looked down at the dogs again. They didn't move. They didn't need praise. Their job was done. And as the vehicles began to leave, one by one, Margaret realized something profound. The storm hadn't hidden the truth. It had carried it straight to her door, to be why late afternoon, the road began to clear. Police vehicles pulled away one at a time, their tire tracks slowly disappearing beneath fresh snow. The flashing lights were gone, the shouting, the tension. All that remained was Margaret's quiet cabin and the low sound of wind moving through trees. For the first time that day, it felt still. The handler stayed behind. He crouched near the dogs, checking their paws again, running practiced hands along their sides. They allowed it, calm and patient, but their eyes kept drifting back to Margaret, as if checking that she was still there. "They've been through too much," he said softly, standing up. "Physically, they'll recover. But returning to duty right away, that's not possible." Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. She had assumed this moment would come quickly, that the dogs would be taken, loaded into a vehicle, and disappear from her life as suddenly as they had entered it. The handler hesitated before speaking again. "We'll need a temporary placement," he said. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe." Margaret looked down at her hands. Thin, weathered. Hands that had spent years alone, fixing what broke, enduring what came. She didn't think of herself as anyone's solution. The dogs made the choice before she did. One leaned against her leg. The other sat directly at her feet, close enough that she could feel its warmth through her coat. The handler watched, then gave a small, knowing smile. "They've already decided," he said. Margaret's voice caught when she finally spoke. If they need a place," she said carefully, "they can stay. For as long as they need." No one rushed her. No one pressured her. The handler simply nodded. "Thank you," he said. Not formally, not officially, just human to human. As the last vehicle disappeared down the road, Margaret closed the door behind them. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The dogs lay down, exhausted but peaceful. And for the first time in years, Margaret's cabin no longer felt empty. Winter loosened its grip slowly. The snow outside Margaret's cabin thinned day by day, revealing the same narrow road she had walked for years. Only now, she never walked it alone. The dogs followed her everywhere. Not out of duty, not out of training, simply because they chose to. One returned to service weeks later, strong again, focused, ready. The morning the handler came to collect him, Margaret stood on the porch and watched quietly. There were no speeches, no cameras, just a long moment where the dog pressed his head against her leg, breathing her in, as if memorizing safety. Then he left. The other stayed. Doctors said retirement was best. Too much exposure, too much strain. Margaret nodded as if she had expected that answer all along. The cabin adjusted to its new rhythm. 2 bowls by the fire, extra blankets by the door, soft footsteps following her from room to room. At night, when the wind returned, the dog would lift his head and listen. Not guarding, just aware. And Margaret slept better than she had in years. News never really mattered to her, but neighbors began stopping by. Some brought food. Some just wanted to shake her hand. She never accepted praise. She corrected them every time. "I didn't do anything special," she would say. "I just opened the door." But the officers knew better. So did the dogs point one evening. As the sun dropped behind the trees, Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. The dog rested beside her, warm and steady. She looked down at him and smiled, a small smile, tired but full. The world hadn't changed overnight. Storms still came. Danger still existed. Injustice still found ways to hide. But something important had been proven. That kindness doesn't need instructions. That courage doesn't always arrive with noise. And that sometimes doing the simplest thing, when it would be easier to turn away, can save lives you will never fully understand. That night, an old woman didn't rescue a hero. She gave shelter. And in doing so, she became the safest place on earth, for a truth that refused to freeze in the dark.